Thank you and welcome to the show this morning. Now today the episode of the show will be facts of my death. Well, Dr. Haney's death. Now this morning we have Dr. James Haney on the show. Now mainly you will see him in camera 2 and him basically doing all this. Now most of the time I know that you see me doing the background education, but today we would like to see something about you. Now Dr. Haney, please give me in a real sense some of your background education, little stuff about you and why we're here today.
Very good. One reason I wanted to deal with this today, Alana, we wanted to call this the facts of my death. And I think that what we've done, we've sort of laid the foundation by having you who will be able to give us information in reference to what happened. It all goes back to the 15th of January of 2013. It appeared that my wife was in some distress. She was having some problems with her leg, and it was decided
torn
tissues in her leg. And why don't you give us some information in reference to how that occurred?
Well, on the morning of January 15th, me and you were getting ready to go to school. Well, you were getting ready to take me to school, and then you'd go off to work. Now, when I was walking past my grandmother's room, I heard her in distress. I heard her crying. So I went into her room, and I said, "Grandmother, are you okay?" And she was like, get James, because y'all will need to have to take me to the hospital because she had torn tissue in her leg." And now, after we had put her in the car, and then we went off to the Summit Hospital in Hermitage, Tennessee. When we arrived at the hospital, the doctor started running tests on her, asking her questions, and me and you were just kind of watching and waiting, being pretty nervous. Now, as she went off to her x-ray, I went, "Hey, Papa, let's go get some hot chocolate," because I'm pretty thirsty. So we went down to the lower level of the hospital and got some hot chocolate. When we came back up, my grandmother was coming back from her x-ray. And now, as I remember, you were sitting in a chair quite like this, and then you crossed your fingers like this and put them to your chest, and you kicked your feet up on the bed, and you went, "Y'all, I need to take a nap." And so basically, we were like, I was like, "What? Where you gonna take a nap?" I mean, really, you said I need to lay down and take a nap, and I was like, "Where are you gonna lay down?" I mean, my grandmother had the bed, your wife. She had the bed, so I'm like, where would he lay down? And then at that moment, your mouth opened, but nothing came out. And then your eyes rolled to the back of your head, and you started foaming at the mouth. So after that, you started shaking like you were like freezing, shaking, like you were scared and freezing all at the same time. And so I shook you. I was like, "Papa, wake up, Papa," because you weren't moving anything. Your mouth was open. You were foaming at the mouth, and your eyes were completely white. You were shaking. So I was like, "Papa, wake up, Papa." And then after that, I flew out the door. I basically ran out the door, and I went, "We need nurses. We need doctors. My grandfather, he's having a heart attack. Help us, help us." And so they ran back into the room, and then there was this one nurse, and she had stopped in the room and said, "Oh my God."
And so let me interject here, Alana, during this first segment, because at this point I had literally lost my consciousness. I was no longer able to understand anything, and not only had I lost my consciousness, but when the doctors from across the hall reached the examination room, they found my wife still on the bed, but at the same time they found me unconscious and
in a chair.
And they immediately put onto the end of my finger a machine that indicated that
would read your pulse on a machine that was about over there, to the right of me.
Flat out. It flat out indicated I did not have a pulse.
Line, like you were not alive. Like, because a live person, everybody has a pulse. If you're alive and walking and breathing, you have a pulse. I have a pulse. Well, at the time you didn't have a pulse, but you now have a pulse.
Nor did I have a heartbeat as we entered this end of this first segment.
As every living person does.
And then I not only had I lost my consciousness, but I also lost my pulse, and I had lost my heartbeat. And so the issue for the next 13 minutes was dealing with getting me back into life. And so it took 13 minutes. And so we're going to take this first commercial break, and I appreciate you opening this for us because I think that you gave us some good information in reference to it. But when we come back, what I want you to do is to pick up at the point where I literally lost my consciousness, my pulse, and my heartbeat, and some of the activities that only you were able to see because everybody else was rushing around. And we'll be back with you following this very, very short commercial break.
Welcome to the second segment of the show. Now, this show basically focuses on Dr. Haney's death and resurrection. Now, if you're just tuning in, we basically discussed us going into the hospital and basically him losing his consciousness, his pulse, and his heartbeat. Now, where we left off was one of the nurses stopping in the doorway and saying, "Oh my God." And that was basically when they picked my grandmother up off the bed and they placed you onto the bed. Now, after they placed you onto the bed, they put their hands together like this and they started doing chest compressions on you. While one was doing chest compressions, another put a little machine on your finger and hooked you up to a pulse machine. And while one was doing that, another was still doing chest compressions. And then while they were doing that, they were feeling your neck, your head, and all this other stuff. And it was so much commotion in the room because there were about 7 nurses. There were 7 nurses, me, my grandmother, and your dead body. And so being in a room with 9 people in a dead body is not very comforting, especially if it's your grandfather's dead body. So back where I left off. When the nurse stopped and said, "Oh my God," she had basically realized that you were dead. Well, in the process of dying. Basically like we all realized. So as they hooked you up to that machine, your pulse was a straight line. Like there was no pulse. You had no pulse. And then one lady felt your heartbeat. You had no heartbeat. You were basically a dead person because dead people don't have heartbeats. Dead people don't have pulse. And dead people don't have consciousness. They're dead. That's the whole point of being dead. You don't live. And so after about 10 minutes of you still doing chest compressions, them doing chest compressions on you, my grandmother weeping and screaming and crying, and me sitting there shaking you and begging you to wake up, I stepped outside of the room, and I got my iPhone out, and I texted my mother, and I said, "Mom, Papa just died." And after I texted her that, I texted my cousin saying, "Jordan, there's been a family death." And he had said, "Who died?" And I said, "Papa." After that, he didn't respond. And after about 2 minutes more, going into 12 minutes of them still beating on your heart, a nurse had reached for a cover to pull over your face to basically pronounce you dead. And she had it about to right here when you woke up, basically. And when you woke up, your pulse started turning from a line into zigzags, and you were moving, and you moved your fingers, you blinked, you were looking up and down, and then you started laughing. You were like, "What are y'all doing to me?" And I was like, "Oh, thank you, Lord, you brought my grandfather back." Now, what I want to ask you is, how did it feel in that moment when you were dead? Like, did it feel long? Did it hurt? What did you experience? What did you hear? What did you feel? What did you see?
Alana, it's almost impossible for me to really get my mind around this experience, because it was both a physical experience, and I think it was witnessed as a physical experience by all of you in the hospital at the time. But as far as I was concerned, it was a period in which I had lost consciousness, and I was in a period of complete darkness for a long time. But at the same time, when I came to see the situation that I was in, it appeared that on the right-hand side, I was laying down on my back in front of the pearly gates. And on the right-hand side was Jesus Christ, and on my left was St. Peter. And it appears that from what I was able to later reconstruct through my own consciousness, it appears that Peter had called me up in the sense that he had the responsibility of calling people out of life into death. And now, I know that might sound strange and all of these images and etc., but nevertheless, that was the experience that I had been called up. And another thing that was very, very peculiar to the situation is that while he had called me up, it seems that I was experiencing what might be considered the everyman experience of death, because I was in front of the pearly gates on my back with Peter on my left and Christ on my right, and Peter reading what I considered to be for a long time an obituary of me. But later on, I was able to sort of filter it out, and I was able to come to the conclusion that that indeed was my page in the book of life. That is, that each person that dies has a page within the book of life, and that he literally read my page. As a matter of fact, I think, as the prophets say, he told me everything that I had ever done. And even now, I can graphically depict some of the things that happened in my earlier experiences growing up, and that Peter, in a real sense, had, when he came to the end of this page in my book of life, Christ responded, "Send him back." And of course, that's when Peter went into a real dissertation in terms of my efforts and why I ought not to.
I'm sorry to kind of inject this, but when you mean dissertation, what do you mean? Like, what did his voice sound like? Was he mad or sad or agitated or just calm?
Everything seemed to be very, very calm. The whole experience was that I didn't see either of the two, but I felt that there was Peter on my left and that Christ on my right, and that since I had been called up and Peter had read my page in the book of life, I was able to somehow understand that that was sort of the usual experience. But what was unusual about it was, after that had been read, Christ declared, "For